Hello, good evening. I hope you can hear me. My name is Sarah MacDougall, and I'm really delighted to be here with you this evening as part of the Art UK Art Unlocked series. And firstly, I'd like to thank Art UK and Bloomberg Philanthropies for the kind invitation to speak to you this evening. It's really an enormous pleasure to be here with you all and to have the opportunity to introduce to you, in something of a whistle-stop tour, just a few of the highlights from the Benary collection. So before I turn to those, I just wanted to briefly outline the history of Benary and of our collection. So Benary was founded in 1915 in London's East End by Russian Jewish immigrant artist Lazar Berson, to provide a platform and support for fellow Yiddish-speaking Jewish immigrant artists and craftsmen working outside the cultural mainstream. It was named after Bezalel Benary, the biblical creator of the tabernacle, and the name was chosen to indicate kinship with the Bezalel School of Art in Jerusalem, because it was named after Bezalel Benary, who was the biblical creator of the tabernacle, and also the name indicated a kinship with the act of making itself. So Berson had studied painting in St. Petersburg, where he was influenced by a renewed interest in Russian and Jewish folk art and craft, and he took these ideas with him to Paris, where there was a general resurgence of interest in Jewish folk art and craft as well. He took those ideas with him from St. Petersburg. So in Paris, he joined that famous loose informal grouping of artists who became known as l'École de Paris, and more particularly l'École de Paris Juif, the mainly Eastern European, mainly Jewish immigrant artists who went to Paris, the city of light, in search of cultural, personal and artistic freedoms. And together there, many of them studied at l'École des Beaux-Arts, they exhibited in the Salon d'Automne, and they lived at the famous La Ruche or Beehive Studios in Montparnasse, where Berson himself shared an apartment address with Jacques Lipchitz, whose work you see here on the left of the screen. So other famous artists associated with l'École de Paris, of course, are people like the designer Léon Bakst and the painter Chaim Soutine, as well as Marc Chagall, whose work I shall return to shortly. So Berson from Paris came to England and founded Benary, as I've said, in the midst of the First World War. And after founding Benary, he was able to develop his primary interest in decorative art and the carving of wooden vessels, plates and boxes. And in the Benary studio in West London, he brought together a number of East End artisans who created similar objects to these. And he also created in 1915 a fundraiser for Benary, a Yiddish art album. And you can see on the design on the right, which incorporates these sort of birds and flowers and signs of the zodiac. Also, I think you can just make out the Yiddish lettering, which is on that inner rim of the design. And the design was made to mark Benary's progress towards the end of its first year. After that, however, Berson disappeared very suddenly from the story in 1916. However, Benary continued, and in 1918, it began to form its own collection. It was led in this by the Polish-Jewish jeweler, Moshe Oved, who was later a self-taught sculptor, and he put together a very eclectic selection of works at the beginning of the Benary collection. So firstly, Benary acquired a tranche of works by Simeon Solomon, the Pre-Raphaelite artist who came from a gifted family of artists. There was his older sister Rebecca and his older brother Abraham. And he followed Abraham to the Royal Academy schools and became a regular Academy exhibitor, and was also associated very closely with Dante Gabriel Rossetti's Pre-Raphaelite circle. So he had a highly successful early career, and the work on screen ties into his interest in reflecting his own culture and religion, which happened both at the beginning of his career and again at the end of his career, when he created this work, but was somewhat divorced at that time from his observance as a Jew, and was probably drawing on memories of ceremonies he would have seen as a child. His successful career was interrupted in 1873 and really fatally terminated by his arrest for homosexual activity. He was prosecuted, his prison sentence was suspended, but he drifted into alcoholism and destitution and died in the St. Giles Workhouse in 1905. The next significant acquisition was made in 1920, and Ovid knew already David Bomberg, Whitechapel artist associated with early British modernism. He had designed a poster for Ovid's jewellery shop, and this work was bought direct from the artist for the collection in 1920. It's a very important work for Ben-Uri because it reflected the roots, the founding area of Ben-Uri, and also the area which Bomberg was associated with himself. He grew up in Whitechapel, was part of another loose informal grouping of artists known retrospectively as the Whitechapel Boys. And the work that he created here drew on his attendance at the Yiddish Theatre, the Pavilion Theatre in Whitechapel, where the classics were performed in Yiddish. When he painted it, however, in 1920, it was following the First World War, and he was profoundly and personally disillusioned, and that's reflected in this kind of savage masterpiece we see here. Finally, from that early selection is this work by the Polish master Samuel Herschenberg, bought for Ben-Uri in 1923 by public subscription, early crowdfunding, if you like. And Ben-Uri actually raised £143 to buy this huge monumental work. And ostensibly, it shows us 3 generations of a Jewish family gathered for observance on the Sabbath. However, there are certain clues in the picture which tell us that it's also, like many of the works in Ben-Uri, a story about migration. So the alternative title for the painting is Letter from Argentina, and certain details in the painting support this, such as the larger of the 2 portraits, which is of Baron Hirsch, who was a tireless supporter of Jewish immigration to Argentina. On this slide, we see a response to that painting by another Polish Jewish artist, Alfred Wollmark, who came to England as a child and was associated with the Whitechapel Boys, sometimes known as the father of the Whitechapel Boys, as he's from an older generation. And he was also vice president of Ben-Uri for many years. And he responded by transposing the scene from Eastern Europe to East London in a journey very much like his own. But we also see in that detail, that industrial landscape beyond the window, that he's also making an artistic identification with British artists, with the Camden Town movement that was then prevalent in this period. So from 78 works in 1930, the Ben-Uri collection grew and comprises today around 1,500 works by 446 artists from 42 different countries. 2/3 of them are immigrants, and 1/3 are women. And that reflects very much the century in which the collection was formed. So also reflecting its origins, it comprises principally late 19th, 20th and 21st century Jewish artists. But since 2002, our remit has expanded to include immigrant artists to the UK from all national, ethnic and religious origins. So as such, the collection today reflects three principal waves of migration: that of our founders that we've seen, like Lazar Berson, who came around 1880 to 1915. Then the so-called Hitler emigres, who came around 1933 to 45, fleeing Nazi persecution. And thirdly, currently the smallest part of our collection, but ever expanding and reflecting the ongoing story of post-Second World War migration to this country. And my highlights tonight will reflect these three waves. So you see on screen a poster on the left for our centenary exhibition Out of Chaos at Somerset House in 2015. And on the right, a poster for a film called Break by the artist Edwin Mingard, himself of immigrant descendants, who was commissioned to create a response during the exhibition. And this tells a fictional story. It's a film based on real life testimonies of a recently arrived Muslim immigrant Egyptian who is confronting the reality of living as a migrant in the big city. And shots in the film and certain scenes in it respond to works in the collection, such as this one by Mark Gertler that you see on the left. And that brings me to my first highlighted choice this evening. So I must declare here a special interest in Mark Gertler, as it was he, in a sense, who brought me to Benary in 2002, following my publication of a biography of the artist. I was invited to curate a Gertler exhibition, my first at Benary in 2002. And as we were preparing for this, the gallery purchased from the previous owner, Sir Jeremy Hutchinson, one of Gertler's most powerful early Jewish works, the Rabbi and Rebbitzin that you see here now on screen. So Gertler's own background is really key to this work. He was born in a slum lodging house in Spitalfields to Austrian Jewish immigrant parents in 1891. And the following year, the whole family was repatriated to Galicia, then in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and now in southern Poland. After his father's departure to seek work in America, the family lived on the brink of starvation until they were eventually reunited back in London in 1896, scarcely a mile from where Mark had been born. Gertler claimed to remember little of those years, but the stories from those Galician years were strongly imprinted on his memory by his mother, and they resurfaced in a series of peasant portraits for which he provided the focus. This one from 1913 in the Glyn Vivian Art Gallery is a particularly good example, and you see how he has responded here to the work of the artist Cézanne and reinterpreted it again in an East End setting. We see that Gertler's mother has been sort of primitivized. It's a very different portrait from the Slade portraits he made of her before, and the emphasis is on these huge working hands. He put the same huge working hands into his Rabbi and Rebbitzin. More properly, this should be known as the Rebbitzin, the rabbi's wife. And he said that this was to indicate suffering and a life that has known hardship. So Gertler was one of the Whitechapel boys, as I mentioned, with Blomberg, this again a loose group of artists and writers who grew up in the East End, were associated with it and with each other through ties of art training, ethnicity and friendship. Blomberg brought them together uniquely in the exhibition, a so-called Jewish section, as part of a wider exhibition of modern movements, at the Whitechapel Art Gallery in 1914. And that was actually the only time that they showed together in their lifetime. Returning to the picture, we can see one of the inspirations for it are these Egyptian statues from the British Museum. And Gertler had been taken there by Epstein, who co-curated the Jewish section with Blomberg at the Whitechapel. And Gertler was enormously inspired by what he called the husband and wife statues. You see here that he's borrowed that gesture, that joining of the arms at the center of the two figures that really brings them together and yokes them to their surroundings in the picture on the right. And for me, what's really special about this picture is that Gertler shows us firstly this typical scene of Jewish East End life of the period, but he explores it with this modernist vocabulary. We have the cubist dresser behind the different viewpoints which you see all those objects from, and then these simplified and enlarged figures with their large working hands and their huge eyes. So there's a sort of tension between the traditional way of life, the incipient warfare, this is made in 1914, which threatens to overwhelm it, and then this modernist vocabulary used to depict them all. And I was delighted to discover that you can see in the picture actually the squaring up where he had intended to make a larger painting, and the squaring up would allow an artist to transfer the work to canvas to do that. And in a collaborative project with Professor Eva Bernstock of the Courtauld, we found the start of this composition beneath another painting. He chose to paint over it, perhaps deciding that the composition here on the left was sufficient. And finally, in a kind of note of circularity, the companion piece for this, which is known as Rabbi and Rebbitzin with Fish, and is a much more surreal composition, and that today is in the British Museum. So my second choice is this work by Marc Chagall, Apocalypse on Lilas Capriccio, which was made in 1945, when the artist was in New York. So he had gone to New York with his wife Bella following the German occupation of Paris in 1940. They spent a year in Vichy, France before they were able to escape to America on forged visas, and they had assistance to do that. Beforehand, however, while he was still in France, where he had made his name and reputation, Chagall had painted this white crucifixion, the first of a series of crucifixions that he made, and which feature Christ as a Jewish martyr on the cross. In the white crucifixion, you can see the bearded figure, the covered head, the talit or prayer shawl used as the loincloth, and scenes of pogroms and Jewish suffering around him. In the picture in 1945, this has a special significance because this is the first painting that Chagall created after coming out of mourning for his late wife Bella, who had died suddenly while they were in exile in 1944. He stopped painting, but as the news of the concentration camps broke through the Pathé newsreels, he felt compelled to pick up his brush and make an artistic response. And we have some of the tropes of the picture before, the Jewish phylacteries, those fringes and the box on the forehead and the prayer shawl behind. But we also have new details. Remarkably, this is an hermaphrodite figure with male and female attributes. And that's thought to be that Chagall is paying tribute to all the victims of the Holocaust. There may also be a reference to his late wife Bella. On the right, we see the clocks of the hand have stopped at the moment of the apocalypse. And there are other details such as the Nazi at the foot of the cross with the bestial tail and the reversed swastika sign. He was not the only artist, of course, to use the symbol of Christ on the cross as a Jewish martyr, and this is a real cri de coeur from the collection by the artist Emmanuel Levy, who was based in Manchester. My next choice is another of the so-called Hitler emigres. He is Joseph Herman, who was a Polish-Jewish artist born in Warsaw. He left Warsaw because of anti-Semitism in 1938, went to Brussels for artistic reasons. He admired the Belgian painters, and then with the outbreak of war was forced to leave there, go through France, and ended up in Glasgow in 1940. And there in Glasgow, he became part of a surprising resurgence, a kind of revitalization of the Glasgow art scene, to which Herman and his fellow Polish Jew, Jankel Adler, contributed. And they came together with the Scottish colorist J.D. Ferguson to really form part of this vibrant art scene. The picture, sorry, I've went a little quickly. The picture here by Adler is his own response to the themes of loss and displacement, really, and to his own personal feelings at the time. He was separated from his own wife and child throughout the conflict. Herman is much better known for works like this on the left, the scenes of the mining community, which would make his name. Some years later, in 1944, he went to live there for almost a decade. And the work on the right, just glimpsed here, is from a series created in Glasgow called A Memory of Memories. But going back to the refugees, this one is very specifically evoking Warsaw. We see the blue palette, we see the moonlit spires. These are particular symbols for Herman of his lost native city. And we see this refugee family at the front. They're both a kind of specific evocation of perhaps his own story, of the uncertainty of his own family. He would learn during the war that his entire family had been killed in the ghetto, and he was nursed back to health from a breakdown by Jankel Adler. This work was created before that, but we see in the family a kind of universal symbol of refugees, of families uprooted and displaced by the upheavals of war. This work was actually thought lost for many years because he considered it to be too similar to the work of Chagall, and he destroyed most of the work from this period in 1948. I turn next to another Hitler emigre, and this is Eva Frankfurter, who came to Britain as a child in 1939. Initially with her siblings, she was reunited afterwards with her stepmother and father. And throughout much of the war, she was further displaced by attending a refugee school for refugee children and then being evacuated during the Blitz. After the war, she studied at St. Martin's School of Art, and her fellow pupils there were two fellow artists with immigrant backgrounds. So that was Frank Auerbach, who had made a similar journey to her own. His parents would also be unfortunately killed in the Holocaust, and also his great friend Leon Kossoff, who was of course of Russian Jewish immigrant descent. So they studied together at St. Martin's, and they remembered Eva as her work being contemptuous of tricks or gloss and full of feeling for people. So just a brief shot there of Eva's self-portrait from around this period. Returning to the waitresses, this is part of a body of work which is really among her greatest achievements. She took as her subject really people on the margins, and she took in particular the new communities who were arriving in Britain post-war. West Indian, Irish, Cypriot and Pakistani immigrants, English whom the welfare state has passed by. These were the people amongst whom I lived and worked and made some of my best friends, she observed. So she made particular friends among the Windrush generation. And I think you can see here the great empathy she has for her subjects. She was a co-worker alongside the waitresses at Lyons Corner House in Piccadilly, where she worked for 5 years. She supported herself so that she could paint during the day, and she took as her subject her co-workers around her. So there's a kind of documentary side to that, in that she's documenting the new communities and also showing us that transition from the kind of waitressing where they were so-called famous nippies who ran quickly between the tables, to this new cafeteria style where the waitresses are ladling out food from the old bain-maries. And this kind of rose-colored background that she uses shows her sympathy, in particular, for working women. From Eva Frankfurter, we pass to the first of our two contemporary artists, Tam Joseph, who came to us after seeing the Out of Chaos exhibition. And he too came to England in that Windrush generation from the Caribbean island of Dominica at a similar age to Eva Frankfurter and Auerbach. He came at the age of 8. He later studied at Central School of Art and then the Slade, and afterwards worked on Yellow Submarine, the animated film featuring the Beatles. Then he traveled extensively in Europe, in Asia, in Africa, and all these things fed into his work. In the handmade map of the world that he made in 2013, he described it as exploring the many and multifaceted inspirations, aspirations, and contradictions that shape contemporary realities. The work is very popular, and it was used for a series of posters as part of the Edinburgh Festival, shown here in 2014. And really what Tam does here is to combine his interest in the natural world with the sometimes seemingly arbitrary territorial divisions. He draws on childhood recollections of the map of the British Empire and those famous areas of pink, and his later awareness of the divisive legacy of colonialism, playfully but also deliberately reordering conventional geographies, blurring boundaries, and suggesting new and unexpected possibilities for the world political map. So my final choice this evening is Zori Sharoki. Zori is a British-Iranian artist working here in Britain, and the work on screen is one of a pair of works that she made as a commissioned response to an exhibition called Liberators about women artists from the Benary collection from 2018. And the work that you see here features in the center a swallow, which you can also see in these two works now on the screen. So Zori and Tam came to us together in this exhibition Unexpected, which we showed at the gallery in 2016, and in which we included this installation by her called Flying, with 54 hand-tied swallows comprising scraps of Persian cloth and thread sent to her by her relatives in Iran. So she brings together sort of remembrance of things like rug making, textile making, patterning of her native Iran, and she combines that with an interest in issues and perceptions around displacement, exploitation, and gender oppression. And that brings us back to Revolution Street 2. This is the companion piece in which you can see swallows from cloth feature once again. And in the piece I began with, you see how some of those things are evoked in this flat work. So we have a textile pattern, even though it's a flatly made piece without the cloth this time, it actually evokes a piece of cloth in the diamond patterning. And here she is drawing on the act of revolution, as it was called, the so-called Revolution Street Girls, who in Tehran in 2018 began to remove their headscarves in protest against the compulsory wearing of the hijab. So I hope you have enjoyed this whistle-stop tour, this glimpse into our collection this evening, and that you'll continue to see more of our art on Art UK and on our website at benuri.org, as well as our sister site, which explores the Jewish and immigrant contribution to British visual art since 1900. Thank you all very much for your attention this evening. It's been really fantastic to spend time with you, and I'm sure you'll continue to see all of the Art UK future talks. Thank you.